For Constable in love, the next 4 years were an emotional roller coaster ride, played out in the correspondence. His father cautions him against settling down before he can afford to keep a wife. In East Bergholt, the family tiptoe around the doctor as if he's an unexploded bomb, and receive frostily polite bows in the street. Maria was swept along whether she liked it or not.
She was almost frightened by the strength of his feelings, because he told her that he was in complete despair and near suicide at times at the thought of not being able to pursue the relationship and eventually to marry her. And he was ecstatic about the prospect of marriage should that come about. But having been, I think, from time to time intimidated by this, she was eventually attracted by it. And it was the prompt to the development of her own feeling, which clearly blossoms in the correspondence.
Maria is practical enough to know that they cannot live without money, and when Constable writes that he's so hard at work sketching in the landscape that he's practically become a hermit, he gets a pretty sharp reply from her. That's not what she wants at all. She wants a successful artist. In those days, public success began and ended with the Royal Academy exhibition, held annually at Somerset House. This was a public spectacle, occasionally bordering on a riot, captured in Rowlandson's famous exhibition staircase. Landscapes weren't particularly fashionable in an age and nation besotted with bosomy portraits. A man like John Constable had many prejudices to overcome. For centuries, art had been ranked according to subject matter. At the top of the scale was history painting, then portraiture, then pictures of dogs and horses. Bottom of the heap was landscape. Constable was going to destroy this time-honoured hierarchy. His winters were spent in London working on his entries for the Academy exhibition. Summers were an escape back to Suffolk, a pattern of activity that produces some of the most sensual and atmospheric oil sketches of his career. He paints his landscape, but I think he's also thinking of Maria, or about his own thwarted desires. He writes a letter to her at the time, half guiltily describing landscape as "my mistress," an erotically charged phrase, which suggests an awareness that he's working out his passions in these paintings. Suffolk becomes more of a refuge than ever when, in 1813, her father bans him from seeing her altogether. His sketchbooks from this time were begun as a sort of journal for Maria, a way of keeping her in touch with what he was doing. But they take on a life of their own, become a wealth of images for a whole career.
He produced tiny drawings which evoke colour, tone, movement, and don't simply act as templates for paintings. Little complete images of artworks which nonetheless have all this burden of a personal response put upon them.
In 1815, his mother, who had been constant in her support of the couple, died from a seizure while tending her beloved flower garden. The next year, things come to a head. Dr. Rudd's still threatening to cut Maria out of his will, and Constable's father dies, leaving them the prospect of a small income. His friend, the Reverend John Fisher, had recently married, and now he offered to perform the ceremony for John and Maria. Constable was 40, she was 28, and they simply couldn't bear to be apart any longer. They decided to get married. On October the 2nd, 1816, John Constable and Maria Bicknell finally tied the knot at St. Martin-in-the-Fields. It was a small ceremony, no family present. They wanted to get it over and done with as quickly as possible. And immediately they came to Weymouth Bay on their honeymoon with the Fishers. It's a cliché, but it was the happiest time of their lives. They walked outdoors in all weathers, judging by the fantastically exuberant oil sketches that he made at the time. It's now that Constable redoubles his efforts to shine at the Royal Academy. He has a wife to support, and in very short order, children. Maria has a miscarriage in February and gives birth to their first child, John, the following October. That year at the Academy, he exhibited a painting of Flatford Mill, which he'd painted the previous summer, at one point asking Maria for a postponement to the marriage in order to finish it. It's a distillation of his boyhood places. The married couple lived in London, and Constable wouldn't go back to Suffolk for anything more than a short visit on family business for many years. The picture marks the end of an era. With both his parents dead, his younger brother Abram takes over the mill, but the countryside is changing now the war with France is over. In a few years, Abram will report the signs of decline, fires, vagrants, riots. But none of that is here yet. It's laboriously painted, in some detail, as if he wanted to get all his boyhood places down in one image. And it's very emphatically signed. Here's a man desperate to make his name. But it wasn't enough. Constable decided that in order to break down the doors of indifference at the Academy, size mattered. It was hard for unadorned nature to catch the eye in this brothel of competing pictures, but he had a big idea. He'd paint a different canal scene every year for the next 7 years, but they would be larger. They became known as his 6-footers. The Haywain, which Constable actually titled Landscape Noon, is the most famous of these, nowadays almost oppressively familiar. It was more appreciated abroad than in England, becoming one of the hits of the 1824 Paris Salon. The idea of painting everyday country life on this heroic scale was new, but what really struck the French was Constable's homegrown style of painting. There'd been nothing quite like these glittering highlights of white paint, suggesting the brilliance of noonday sun. Fleeting effects of light, wind and weather were coming to preoccupy Constable. He was looking to his skies. In 1821, the Constables leased a house in Hampstead, and John started coming regularly to Hampstead Heath, where he painted particularly the skies. He'd decided by then that depicting the sky was the key to improving his finished work, to getting into it, the kind of emotional vitality and immediacy that he'd already managed to get into his oil sketches. He said the sky was the chief organ of sentiment. And it's from this period, I think, that his work really takes another great leap forward. And once again, Maria's indirectly responsible. They had to move to Hampstead because she suffered from tuberculosis and couldn't bear the smogs of London. This was the only place where the air was clear enough for her to breathe. Hampstead was still countryside then, a 3-mile walk from London. Constable felt he had the best of both worlds. The Heath was another working landscape, but unlike the Stour Valley, its height and flatness seemed to force the sky into dominance in his paintings. It's interesting to speculate what changes in his art result from the fact that Constable was now happily married. He and Maria could walk the landscape together, and the frustrations of their courtship were long gone. Dr. Rudd had died in 1819, leaving Maria an equal share in his estate. But the family was still not well off. Constable wasn't selling paintings, and their 4th child, Isabel, was born in Hampstead. Constable was a gentle, indulgent father. He loved babies, and Maria was a devoted mother. This affectionate oil sketch is the only known painting of her after their marriage.